Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Dr. and Mrs. Hakim, Mr. and Mrs. Tewitt, Dr. Waters, members of the Emmanuel College community, especially Catherine's class of 1970 and Anne Marie's class of 1964. I'm Sister Mary Johnson, Chair of the Sociology Department, and on behalf of the faculty and students of the department, I'm honored to welcome you to the inaugural lecture of the Catherine McLaughlin Hakim Lecture Series. The Sociology Department is very grateful to Catherine's family for honoring her in this particular way, because Catherine's deepest values continue to be ours. This series will allow us in the years ahead to lift up for thousands of students Catherine's enduring legacy here at Emmanuel. Her fondness for her alma mater, her affection for a sociology professor who influenced and inspired her, Sister Marie Augusta Neal, Catherine's appreciation for the tools of sociology, and her commitment to the social justice agenda lifted up by Emmanuel College. We are proud that our inaugural lecturer, Dr. Mary Waters, embodies so many of Catherine's deepest commitments. Recently, Catherine's brother-in-law, Tony Hakim, and his wife, Mary, wrote to us from Canada on behalf of the family. They said, "Kathy left an indelible mark on everyone she met. She did this with her sweet disposition, her sharp sense of humor, and her kindness toward everyone around her. She always spoke fondly of her years at Emmanuel College. We all miss her very much, but we are consoled by the fact that her memory will live on through this lecture series. We thank you for honoring her and our family in this way. Again, we at Emmanuel thank you for your great gift to us. At this time, I ask Professor Catherine Simpson Bucher, Assistant Professor of Sociology, to come forward to introduce our distinguished inaugural lecturer of the Catherine McLaughlin Hakim Lecture Series. Professor Bucher.
It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Waters to you. Sometimes when one introduces a speaker, the concern is, what should I say? Here the concern is, what can I leave out? Because there's just so much to say. While the focus of an introduction is generally to highlight the academic credentials or achievements of a speaker, I think it's important, particularly in this setting, to highlight some of the more personal aspects. Professor Waters grew up in the Flatbush section of Brooklyn. It comes from a background somewhat similar to many of our students here at Emmanuel. She is the oldest of 8 children and attended Our Lady Help of Christians Elementary School and graduated from St. Xavier High School. Professor Waters then went on to receive her BA from Johns Hopkins and her master's and PhD from UC Berkeley. Professor Waters has been at Harvard since 1986 and is currently the Emmy Zukerman Professor of Sociology. Her work has largely focused on issues of race, ethnicity, immigration, and immigrant incorporation, but also on issues of research methodology and public policy. The number of books, articles, and book chapters number literally into the dozens, as do the number of awards for many of these works. On a personal note, I first became familiar with Professor Waters' research on race, ethnicity, and immigration while I was in graduate school, and it greatly impacted how I thought about these issues and on my own research. Because our focus at Emmanuel is on undergraduates, I don't wait to let our students encounter Professor Waters' work when they get to graduate school, so they read it here as undergraduates. And my students, without fail, cite Professor Waters' work as some of their favorite readings, whether it is Ethnic Options, her work on white ethnicity, Black Identities, her work on West Indian immigrants, or Inheriting the City, her recent work on the second generation of immigrants in New York City. The response to Professor Waters' work speaks to the accessibility of it, of her ability to break out of the academic jargon and really tell a story, but a story that is based on impeccable research. And this component of accessibility is something that all of us in academia need to do to a much greater extent. On an even more personal note, Professor Waters has been exceedingly kind to me in providing feedback on my work, giving suggestions, and always making time. And finally, Professor Waters has shown that one can do all of this and have 3 children. So I'm hopeful. Professor Waters' talk today is not on international migration or immigrant incorporation, the areas with which she's most commonly identified, but on Hurricane Katrina and its aftermath. This topic is particularly relevant to both Emmanuel College generally and to the Sociology department specifically. Since Hurricane Katrina, dozens of Emmanuel College students have gone down to New Orleans on an ongoing basis to assist in the rebuilding of the city. That connection began with Sister Mary Johnson's relationship with the Sisters of the Holy Family, an African-American order of Catholic sisters based in New Orleans. So now, over to Professor Waters, who I thank for crossing the river to come and talk to us about this really, really critical topic. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that very nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me for this this lecture and for everyone for coming. And I really am looking forward to sharing my work with you and hearing maybe about your own experiences in New Orleans, because I know some of you have been down there. So I want to talk about this project that I'm working on. It's been over 5 years now since Hurricane Katrina hit, and as Kathy said, this is not an ordinary project for me. I kind of fell into it, and I'll tell you a little bit about how that happened. It is a joint project, and it's very exciting intellectually. I actually think the future of research in the social sciences is more and more interdisciplinary, and I'm working with an economist, a specialist on education, a clinical psychologist, and a whole team of people on this project, and we've actually branched out, and we're now collecting some genetic information from some of our respondents, looking at what helps people to recover from disasters, and I can talk a little bit about that later if anyone has questions on it. Just to give you a preview of the argument that I'm going to give to you today. The first is kind of the good news, which I didn't know very much about what we know about disasters from all of these different disciplines before I started working on Hurricane Katrina. But the headline good news is that psychological resilience is the most common response to disasters. That human beings actually can bounce back from some of the most difficult circumstances, and the ways in which people come together to bounce back from really terrible situations is really not something that we first think about when we see a disaster unfolding. But time and time again, studies of disasters have shown that most people are able to return to their pre-disaster functioning rather soon after the disaster. That is not to say that disasters don't have terrible impacts on people, but that over the long run, most people will recover. The other thing that I didn't know about before I started studying this, but I'll touch on it today, is that there's something that psychologists call post-traumatic growth, and that some people who have lived through a very hard experience, such as a disaster, talk about actually it in ways about how it led to growth, spiritual growth, psychological growth, and in fact, I think social, open up social opportunities for people. But we know basically nothing about how social resilience, moving to a better neighborhood, getting a better job, changing other aspects of your socioeconomic experiences relate to psychological growth. And whether or not they're related at all, we still don't really know about that. The other thing is that we know that community ties and social ties are incredibly important to recover from a disaster. And I think actually in our treatment of the whole disaster of Hurricane Katrina, we haven't taken that as much into account. And in fact, some public policies and decisions, political decisions about what happened to Hurricane Katrina survivors have made things much, much worse for people in New Orleans because we have thought of them as individuals and not as members of communities. New Orleans is recovering, and you'll read a lot about that in the newspapers about the ways that it's recovering, but it's a changed city. Some of its poorest people have not been able to come back and won't be able to come back. New Orleans actually has its lowest poverty rate right now since 1979, and partly that's because they closed public housing in New Orleans. Rents have gone up so much that the poorest people have not been able to return. Finally, I'm going to talk about the dilemma that people face, that the survivors that we talk to face, about whether to return to New Orleans, because what they're really missing is a sense of community and a culture and a way of life that they had cherished before the hurricane. And some of the people who are feeling the worst are those who did go back to New Orleans and find that that community and that culture is no longer there. And I'll talk about that. So, just to remind you about Hurricane Katrina, it hit in 2005. It was a Category 5 before it hit, but it was a Category 3 when it came ashore. And at first, the city thought that it had dodged a bullet and the hurricane would not cause great damage. But then the levees broke. And this is important, actually, because there's a robust finding in social science research that it's much more difficult for people to respond, to recover from, psychologically, to recover from a man-made disaster than it is from a natural disaster. So a technological disaster or something that has to do with the failure of things that people have put in place are much more difficult for people to come to terms with than a natural disaster. So, for instance, if we're thinking about Japan, and I'll try and come back to Japan at the end of the talk, but if you're thinking about Japan, the earthquake and the tsunami are one thing, but the nuclear disaster is another one, and partly that's because there's someone to blame when the levees break, or when a nuclear power plant starts to fail, in a way that there isn't for an act of God of the earthquake or the tsunami. The overall effects of Hurricane Katrina were quite large, billions of dollars, over 1,800 deaths. 90,000 square miles was declared a disaster area. That's as big as the United Kingdom. It displaced over 500,000 people. 60% of the housing stock in New Orleans City was destroyed, and 30% of the housing stock in the MSA. What's hard to actually convey to people who were not there during the flood is, and that you can't really get from pictures, although this one is a good picture of it, you can see downtown New Orleans off in the distance, is the scope of the flood, of how much of New Orleans was covered. And for those of us from Boston, this is a map of what the flood would look like in Boston. So it actually would stretch from the north end out to Framingham. Why they think Shoppers World is important on this map, I don't know. But it's a key landmark there along the Mass Pike. But we would be in the flood here, and it would have gone from basically over towards the north end all the way out to Framingham. So you can imagine how large this flood was for people in New Orleans. It was devastating for the people who had not evacuated, who were stuck in their homes. And the most awful experiences, I think, were the people who ended up in the convention center. So, how did I get involved in studying this? I was part of a group that was studying community college students around the country and what could keep community college students enrolled. And we were doing experiments in different community colleges around the country. And one of them was Delgado Community College and Louisiana Technical College in New Orleans. And the people who were running the study said, the hurricane hit and all of our data is destroyed. And I thought to myself, well, when a hurricane or a natural disaster hits, I don't know a lot about it, but I do know that it's very rare to have pre-disaster data. And this study had been asking people about their physical health, their mental health. We asked questions like, who would you reach out to in times of trouble? Do you trust the government? Social network data. And so we had a lot of data on these people. And the funding came from the Louisiana Department of Social Services. And so the sample is mostly single mothers who were within poverty guidelines so that they would have been eligible for TANF funds, welfare funds, to be used for this study. So we had about 1,000, a little bit over 1,000 single mothers enrolled in the community college. Their family income was less than 200% of the poverty level. And they were almost all female. We, in the follow-up, we've just been following up the females, overwhelmingly African American, in their mid-20s. And so the story about our sample is it's not a random sample of New Orleans. It's not the poorest of the poor. It's people who are trying to go to community college, but they were pretty poor, and they were all the mothers of young children. A disproportionate number of our respondents came from the 9th Ward. We did a survey. We had 2 data points before the hurricane hit. We were literally interviewing when the hurricane hit. We went back and we found 82% of these people, wherever they were around the country after the hurricane hit, because we had their social security numbers, because it was a longitudinal study. And basically what I also learned is if you give someone your social security number, they can find you wherever you go. We also did in-depth interviews, qualitative interviews, with a subsample of the women, with half of them in the New Orleans area, back in New Orleans a year after the hurricane, and half of them in Texas, mostly in Houston, but also in Dallas. The advantages, as I said, are that we had a lot of data from before the hurricane, and also what we do know from disaster research is that poor people and members of minority groups are most at risk for suffering from a disaster. If you don't know New Orleans too well, the Orleans Parish is coterminous with the city of New Orleans. East New Orleans suffered a lot from the floods. Lakeview is a well-off area, also suffered from the floods, which came in from the lake. There was also breaches in various canals that flooded the 9th Ward and the downtown area. This is a map of the depths of the flooding, the red and the black with the highest flooding. Here's the lower 9th Ward. Here's Lakeview, East New Orleans. The extent of the flood goes out in many different directions. And this is a map, and each of the dots is one of our respondents in our survey before the hurricane hit. So some of them were living out in the suburbs that did not get flooded, and the size of the red dot is how large the flooding was at their house. So you can see that this area of the lower 9th Ward, we had many, many people living there, and also in New Orleans East. So people who really suffered a great deal. This is just to show you that about 45% of our sample lived in the 9th Ward. So they were disproportionately hit by the flooding. So what we first did was to do a number of studies looking at the data that we had pre-hurricane in terms of social resources, psychological resources, social support, and looking at outcomes after the hurricane to see what kind of, what knowing about how you were before the hurricane could help in understanding how the hurricane affected your social and psychological outcomes. And we measured two things. One was depression, and the other was PTSD. Now, we had a measure of depression before the hurricane hit because we had collected that data as part of the community college study. But PTSD, we only collected afterwards, and PTSD was kind of common among people. And one of the things that we found, when you do a survey, it's common at the end of a telephone survey, if any of you have done one, to say at the end, is there anything you'd like to add? Because people have been doing multiple choice questions for a long time. And the survey researchers just typed in what people were saying, and there was only room, it's like a Twitter kind of thing, there was only room for a certain number of words. But if you read through what we heard from people at the end of the survey, it was really awful. I mean, people are saying, I had a baby, it was hard, helicopters didn't pick them up, we were stranded on the roof, I tried to get my grandma to come with me, we couldn't, it was horrible, my mom was trapped in the attic. This lady said she was pregnant. Many of our respondents actually were pregnant during the storm. Baby was born at 26 weeks on the roof of the house, surrounded by water. The baby didn't survive. This is just from the tail end of the survey. So it was just overwhelming to us, the kinds of things people wanted to tell us about what they had lived through. Now, this is from our in-depth interviews a year after the storm. And I have two quotes just so that I'm about to give you some quantitative data about people having PTSD. But I think this gives you a sense of the kinds of experiences people have when we measure PTSD. This is what kinds of things happen to them. So the interviewer says, was your daughter sick before the hurricane? And the respondent says, no. And she says, she came on with a fever when we got rescued. We were on top of the roof and it was raining hard. The wind was blowing and we was just hoping and praying somebody will come get us. And we was really hoping that the house didn't fall because of all the water. And I mean, you'd have to be like it to see what really happened. It's just so hard to explain because I thought it was a dream. This is the kind of disassociation people talk about. All I kept telling myself, it's a dream, wake up. It's a dream. And once we got to the old folks' home, we had to walk 5 feet of that mess in water to get to it, the second or third floor. We found out they had dead bodies on the first floor from old folks who didn't get out. So it was a whole lot of people. And what they did was kind of like we went to corner stores and broke in there and tried to get food and stuff so everybody could survive. And then this is a woman who's back now, a different woman, who had been at the convention center, and she's back working now in New Orleans. And she has to take the bus every day, and the bus goes past the convention center on her way to work. And she says, yes, I was at the convention center. I was crying because they left there with no food, sleeping on the ground. And I was crying, and I knew I shouldn't because my kids were right there. So that was making him cry too, and I couldn't help it. You can never get away from what happened, especially when at the Superdome and Convention Center. We will never get over that, how they left us. That's one thing that will always be on my mind. When I'm on the bus going to work or dropping my kids off, I have to pass the Convention Center on the bus. And every time I pass it, the memories just come back. And when my children are on the bus with me, they always say, that's where we were at, that's where we slept, and I'm never going to get over it. So she talks about how she's just triggered each time she goes past this experience, and the PTSD experience comes back, and she has to cope with the horribleness of it again. So what we gathered was data on how much trauma and loss people experienced in the hurricane, their demographic characteristics, their economic status, the amount of social support that they had, and then we had our dependent variables were their mental health before the storm and after the storm, and a scale that measures PTSD, as well as we had measures of their physical health before the storm. We had measures on self-reported health, whether it was fair or poor, number of diagnosed medical conditions, their body mass index. We also had data on drugs and alcohol use, et cetera. And for the people in our sample, Actually, 83% of them did evacuate before the storm hit, although many of the people who evacuated also suffered a lot of trauma along the way. Many of them had housing, water damage that was enormous, personal property damage that was enormous, and lost everything in the flood. This is a list of the hurricane traumas that people could have. Did not have enough fresh water to drink, didn't know if their families were okay. The last one is any of your relatives or close friends killed because of Hurricane Katrina or Rita. And at first we thought that 31% having somebody very close to them die was a very high number because only 1,800 people actually died in the whole hurricane. But because so many of people, our people were from the lower Ninth Ward, we actually asked a follow-up question and asked who was it that died, and it generally was either an elderly relative or somebody from their block or somebody that they knew quite well. So we actually do trust these data. So first we asked what happened to the physical and mental health of people, and what we found was that their psychological and physical distress worsened quite a bit in the first year after the hurricane. So there's the depression scale is called the K6 scale, and that doubled. So the level of depression in the sample doubled over time. The fair or poor related health status went up quite a bit. The number of diagnosed medical conditions went up. And the mental illness was very much similar to national study or local studies of much larger numbers of people in New Orleans. So it went up from 7 to 14% of people with serious depression. About half of our sample had PTSD symptoms a year after post-traumatic stress disorder. Things like shaking or anxiety or not being able to get thoughts out of your mind or phobias, those kinds of things. And what we found was that the loss and trauma that people experienced were related to health status. And what we also found was, and this is very important for studies of disasters because usually there is no physical or mental health status before the hurricane. So the answer, the question that people always have is, yes, you're depressed after the hurricane, but maybe you were depressed before the hurricane. How do we know that the hurricane or the disaster caused it? And what we find is that controlling for baseline depression or health characteristics does not at all explain away the increase that happens, although it does reduce it somewhat, so that people with pre-existing depression are more likely to have a decline in their mental health following the hurricane. We also looked at a question of whether or not if you had more income, if you had access to a working car, if you had a bigger social network, would that have prevented you from experiencing some of the losses in mental and physical health after the hurricane. And what we found was that having more resources, income, access to a car, even a bigger friendship network, did tend to make you evacuate more. So that it did tend to prevent losses, but it did nothing to buffer you from the psychological and physical results of the hurricane if you experienced the traumas. So it reduced the number of traumas you experienced, but it did not at all help you to have more resources if you did experience the hurricane traumas. So then we went back in the field 5 years later and re-interviewed the women. And we did a second follow-up. And we looked at what was the trajectory of their mental health over the period between the first and second follow-up. And what we find is that overall, and this is in terms of PTSD, we had two measures, 67% are either never had PTSD or had it at the first follow-up and don't have it anymore. So about almost 70% are doing well. About a third are still suffering. They either had chronic PTSD, so they had it in both follow-ups, or they had delayed onset PTSD. And I gave this talk at the University of Maryland, and one of the faculty members in the audience came up to me afterwards. He does sociology of the military. And he told me, he said, I really hope you keep following them forever. He said, because the military is dealing with people who are reporting to veterans hospitals now in their 80s, reporting PTSD for the first time from World War II. And he said, sometimes it's when their wife dies or their child dies or something starts it, and the feelings that they've had all their lives bottled up come out. And so he said, you know, he would not be surprised if we found people who would exhibit problems maybe after their children leave home, that they've held it together while their children were young, so that it could happen to you even later in your life, that this would happen. In terms of depression, 70% are doing well, and about 30% still are showing symptoms of depression. Basically, I think I'll speed up to get to some more interesting parts. But basically, the amount of damage and traumas that you had during the hurricane is very much, there's a dose-response relationship, that it does, the declines in your physical and mental health follow how much of the trauma that you've had. And PTSD, as you might imagine, is more related to problems during the hurricane than depression is. So that PTSD is very much tied to the impact of the hurricane, whereas depression may be because of things that have happened to you since the hurricane. One of the other things that we've looked at is this issue of post-traumatic growth. This has been found in other studies of disasters, that people cope with the experience actually by feeling grateful. I kind of sometimes am not a very nice person, and I think to myself, if something like this happened to me, I would be very mad at the world, I'd be mad at God, I would just be very angry. And in fact, most people are not like that. I don't know if I would be like that if it happened to me, but most people are not. And a lot of people actually look for the good that came out of the experience. And if they've survived it and they've recovered, they talk about how, you know, being through adversity has made them a better person. That most, actually, people in our study found that they became more spiritual, they became more religious after the hurricane because they were thanking God for having kept them alive and for keeping their loved ones alive. And that's just, we've just started to analyze this, but this is the whole score, with 0 being a low post-traumatic growth score and 80 being a high one. And we definitely have a lot of people who are experiencing growth in themselves as a result of the hurricane. So the other question is, where did all these people go and what happened to them? And why do they return to New Orleans if they do? This is a quote from a woman describing being put on the bus outside of the convention center, and she said, a lot of these people, they didn't have anything. They had no means of transportation, so they couldn't move. They couldn't go anywhere but where they sent them, and they sent them there. I mean, it was sort of like the people getting put on the train going with the Holocaust, not knowing where they're going, just noting they're headed for trouble when they got there. It was a disaster. And this woman talks about how she's leaving New Orleans for the first time. And New Orleans actually had people who, unlike most Americans, people who grew up in New Orleans don't move around a lot. And so many people, in fact, many of the people we interviewed had never been outside of the city until the hurricane. And so people talked about how it was very shocking for them to go to any place else where they were going and how hard it was to leave the city. So when we interviewed people in 2006, people were, about 50% were in the New Orleans SMSA, and the rest were in other places. By 2010, 13% of our sample were back in their pre-Katrina houses. Most people were not. 35% were in the city, 60% were in the greater New Orleans area, but they were in a lot of different places. So this is where we found them in 2006. That's New Orleans down there. A lot were in Texas, a lot were in Atlanta, Baton Rouge, So people ended up, but we found one person in Alaska, some in California. We found people in lots of different places. This is the FEMA data. So this is where everybody who applied for FEMA money after New Orleans were found. And so our sample is similar in terms of the kinds of dispersion to the national dispersion. So when people come back to New Orleans has changed in fundamental ways. The population has started to come back, although it still is not anywhere near where it was before. The city schools are at about 60% of their pre-Katrina enrollment, but some of those kids are different kids. That's the whole point about New Orleans, is that it's changed fundamentally in that many of the people who come to New Orleans have come since the hurricane, and they are not the people coming back. The lower Ninth Ward, where many of our people were from, only 22% of the housing units are occupied. Average wages have increased. New Orleans is one of the places that didn't suffer the recession that the rest of the country suffered in 2008, 2009. Wages have been going up. Rents have been going up quite a lot. They abolished all public housing, so people who lived in public housing have no place to go back. And the city has become whiter and more Latino, and African Americans have been reduced in number in the city. But violent crime has still increased in the city. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan recently said that I think the best thing that happened to the education system in New Orleans was Hurricane Katrina. That education system was a disaster, and it took Hurricane Katrina to wake up the community to say, we have to do better. I think actually one of the points I want to make is that a lot of the people who are now in New Orleans and who have the low poverty rate, et cetera, are not the same people that you saw in those pictures who lived through the hurricane, because many of those people cannot afford to come back or have found better opportunities elsewhere. So a lot of the kind of good news about New Orleans is about the city, but not necessarily about the people who had lived there before the hurricane. So this is just that the rents and the cost of living has gone back up. So for the people that we found, though, where are they and what are the new neighborhoods like? And what we found, compared the census tract data on where they were before the hurricane and where they are now where we found them. And they tend to be in neighborhoods that have less poverty, that are more integrated, and that have higher education of their neighbors, and generally more jobs. So this is pre and post-Katrina for everyone, and this is the post-Katrina percentage black, percentage white in your local census tract, percentage on public assistance, all of those things. In fact, the changes in the neighborhoods of the people that we have studied over time are as great as some of the experiments that we've been doing in terms of getting people to move to lower poverty neighborhoods. So the impact in the first follow-up of Hurricane Katrina was that people ended up in slightly better neighborhoods. It's even more so if you look at people who were in flooded neighborhoods. So those are the people who were unable to come back to their post-Katrina houses, and the people who were flooded, and they're in much better neighborhoods after the hurricane. Okay, so one question is, what do the people think about these neighborhoods? Do they see them as a better neighborhood to live in or not? And there's a mixed response of the people that we talked to about what they thought. Many people reported better job opportunities, less crime in the neighborhoods they ended up in. Every person reported that the schools were better for their children, wherever they went. Even the worst schools in Baton Rouge or Houston were better for their children than the schools in New Orleans. But many people talked about diversity in their neighborhoods as being a real scary thing for them, that they had never lived with people who spoke another language, that they had never lived with people who were different than they were, and that this was a challenge for them. There was also many accounts of people feeling discriminated against because they were from New Orleans. So people told us about people not wanting to give them jobs because they thought they would not stay for a long period, they would leave again. People suspecting that criminals were moving into their neighborhood because people from New Orleans had come in, especially in Houston and Baton Rouge, where there were a lot of New Orleans people moving in. But mostly people talked about how they missed their strong ties to their families and their neighborhoods and the culture of New Orleans that they had lived in all of their lives. And many people had grown up in these neighborhoods where their sisters and brothers lived nearby and their parents, and everyone was helping together with, to take care of their children, and so they missed that very, very much. Here is a woman who's talking about how she thought that the hurricane was a very bad thing, but at the same time she felt like it provided the push that she needed to get out of New Orleans. My kids, where they're going to brand new schools, the schools are huge. They're like a college campus. They're excited about school. It's not boring. It's not ghetto like the other stuff New Orleans had. So they don't have to worry about is the bathroom clean or not. And all of that plays a major factor in me deciding to stay here because I know they're getting a good education. And they have made friends with people. The neighborhood is mixed. It's not just all black or white. My daughter has white friends, Chinese friends, and they all hang out together. They go out together. They would never have had those experiences in New Orleans. Many people describe their Texas neighborhoods as having less crime. At the same time, New Orleans is a walkable city for most people, and some people described being in Houston and being trapped because they didn't have a car. So there was a trade-off there that they were somewhat safer, but really isolation came out of it again. Many people made their decision about whether or not to return to New Orleans based on what their church did. And in fact, the people who were relocated to Houston were in some ways the best off because so many people went together, and some pastors actually moved their whole church to Houston, and that's what people decided to do. One of the saddest things that we had in the interviews were some people who were in Dallas or Houston, and their church did not move, and they couldn't find another church to go to. And many of them reported that they were just watching the TV evangelists on television and praying there rather than finding a community to go to. But this played a major role. If the pastor relocated to Houston, then people said that they were going to stay. Many people are putting down roots in Houston. And she says that she still considers New Orleans home, but I've learned that it's the past. This is something totally different, so that's not my home anymore. And another woman says, I believe when Hurricane Katrina came and we moved out, it was like God's opportunity to get us away from it and to do a new life. It's like a fresh new start, and we factored in the educational system, and it's a really good place. And then looking back at New Orleans, I still have family that lives down there, and it's just not the best place that my family needs to be right now. So this post-traumatic growth and the idea that you're in a better place comes out again and again in the in-depth interviews for people who have decided to stay. Many people talked about how they had wanted to leave New Orleans before the hurricane. They couldn't get their mother or their grandmother or their sister to move. And then when the hurricane hit, it provided that opportunity for them to go. Pull factors to go back to New Orleans, though, include this discrimination against Hurricane Katrina survivors, that people feel that they might, that their kids are being discriminated against at school, that they're missing the distinctive culture of New Orleans, and they very much missing the social support of family, friends, and neighbors. So here's a woman who says that she thinks people think that they're going to get, that people say they need to go back where they came from. They are not going to get no assistance down here because we have our own problems to deal with. They've got to go back. We were like outsiders, and they treat people from New Orleans very badly. this woman talks about how she is able to resist some of the discrimination because her license plate doesn't identify her as a person from New Orleans. So people are coping with the new diversity on their own. And what comes up again and again is that people are stuck with either individually, if they don't have the community in Houston to get used to a new environment, or the other option is to go back to New Orleans if you can. And the decisions that were made politically about how to redevelop New Orleans were that they kind of shied away from deciding that any neighborhood would either be closed down or collectively reopened. And so people were kind of trapped based on whether or not they had insurance, whether they owned their house and had their mortgage. So if you go to a place like the 9th Ward now, you'll go down a street and there will be very many boarded up houses and then one house alone where people have gone back. And many of the people who went back wanted to, but some said they had to go back because they had no other choice. But they're going back to places which are kind of half alive and half dead, and very isolating places where they're not experiencing what they thought they were going to have when they got back there. So people talk about the strong pull to go back to New Orleans. This woman talks about how she gets scared when she gets lost in the new cities, that it's just not like the place that she grew up in, and that she knows her way around in. And this woman who's living in Louisiana talks, or in Memphis, she talks about how she drives, this is for the holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas, it's always a big holiday down here. So you could just be in your car and smell the food. And when I was in Memphis, you don't smell nothing. I'm like, what is this? And then some people we had met, we don't have no relationship with them, but we met. I was like, what do you all cook for Thanksgiving? And they said spaghetti and meatballs. And I would come take drives to down here to New Orleans. That's like a 6-hour drive. So I would take a drive down here when the stores started back opening and stuff. I would come down here and I'd buy meat and bring it back to Memphis and cook it. Memphis didn't carry a variety of meats like down here. Like, I didn't know that they didn't have salami or like different seasonings that they have down here. Any store that you go to down here, you can find seasonings. And she had moved back in the end. Another person who has moved back says, I hated it. I hated to even have a baby. I told myself, I know it sounds silly, but I said, I'm going to drive to Louisiana and have my baby. So it was like she had to be born in Louisiana. I didn't like the process. No, I didn't like that, the doctor or anything. It's just me wanting New Orleans back, but it just seemed so different. And after she was born, I was in a deep, deep depression. And she goes on about the experience that she said, but with the other two, I had my mom, my mother-in-law, things like that. I didn't have anyone but my husband, and it felt like he couldn't do things the way that they could do things. So this idea that New Orleans was where you had family, where you had social support, where you had culture, is what's bringing a lot of people back, even though they know that when they get back there, they may not have the same opportunities that they're having in the new places that they've gone to. So when people come back, what they find is that the neighborhoods are not what they had been imagining and what they had been hoping to come back to. So this woman says, it's changed a lot around here. I still feel safe, but it's more the people that moved into the neighborhood. They weren't from this area. Okay. And they're not owners, they're more renters, and they are different from our neighbors who were here before the hurricane. And they go home and they go to work, and she's just not having the same experience of connection that she had before. This woman also, who's come back, is describing how Dallas would have been a better place. So here's the dilemma that people are facing. This woman really said it very, very well. If I go back to New Orleans, I know that economically it's not good right now because everything is just not functioning properly. If I stayed out here, things were looking up as far as job-wise, opportunity-wise, but my family's not here. It's boring. I'm lonely. It doesn't feel the same at all. It just feels like I'm just here. So I can go somewhere here, but no one is here with me. But New Orleans is fun. I know people, I'm comfortable, but I'm not going to get anywhere. So that's my battle. So those who returned find a different community than what they had wanted. And part of that, I must say, is a political decision that was made by the city and by the state and by the federal government in how they designed the development, which was very individualistic. It was very much, if you had an insurance company, insurance policy, then you could go back to your house, but there was no coordination about whether a block would be reborn or not. This study, I think, has a lot of relevance for studies about what happens when people leave high poverty neighborhoods individually. There are a lot of government programs now designed to give people vouchers to move them out of neighborhoods, and what they've been finding in these studies, like the Moving to Opportunity study, is that after a little while, people move back to high poverty neighborhoods, and the policymakers are like, why did they do that? We found them a better neighborhood. But the issue is that people are not islands to themselves. And if you take them out of a place in which they feel comfortable, even if the economic opportunities are better, they may feel drawn back. The other thing that I think I would point out is that even though when the hurricane hit and some newscasters were calling the people from New Orleans refugees, and they very rightfully complained about this and said, and challenged it and said, this is my country, I am not a refugee, right? But in fact, their experience is very similar from an analytical perspective, not from a citizenship perspective, but to refugees who are pining for a world that they had to leave behind involuntarily. They may be in a better place and their children are beginning to adjust, but they still have this image of the place that they left behind that they want to go to. And I think the importance of community for disaster relief and relocation is very important. So finally, I just want to end with 1 minute to thinking about Japan, which I know is very much on people's minds right now, the disaster that is continuing to unfold in Japan. I think that what we know from many studies is that people will bounce back. Resilience is the modal response to a disaster. The distinction between a natural disaster and a technological disaster should be understood, that it will be harder for people to recover from the nuclear issues than it was from the earthquake and the tsunami, even if there's more destruction from the earthquake and the tsunami. If you take an important, a longitudinal approach to recovery, it's important that people who had psychological problems before the disaster be given special attention, because they may have it more troubles following the disaster. And it's possible that people will cope with this in the ways that many people coped with it after Hurricane Katrina, that there is this opportunity for post-traumatic growth. And I'm not sure that any disaster relief on the long term actually thinks about maybe how people could get in touch with those kinds of feelings and think about them and share them with one another. That this seems to be something that happens kind of under the radar. And finally, what we do know from many, many sociological studies of disasters is that people need communities to recover from disasters. That individualistic responses, putting people away from extended networks and kin, are never a good way to cope with this, that people need to come together with people that they trust and they know, and that's how disaster plans should be put into effect. So thank you.
We have a few minutes now for questions that you would like to put to Dr. Waters.
Did everyone hear the question? The question was, with people with a higher rate of depression, is there a higher rate of suicide? The rate of suicide kind of goes down immediately after something like this, and then it spikes long-term. So really the people at most risk were those people who were chronically depressed and suffering from PTSD, and yes, there is a spike in suicide for those people. And one of the things about mental health recovery is that a lot of times there's counselors put out in the first few weeks of a disaster. But in fact, it's when the long-term thing hits that people are realizing, oh, I can never go back. That may be when they need the counseling, and then it's not necessarily as available to them.
Follow-up, do you think in Japan that the rate would be even higher since the culture has been
Yeah, the question is whether I would think that it would be high suicide rate in Japan. I think I don't know enough about Japan to speculate about that. It's not an area that I know, but it would be interesting to find out. Yes?
When you mentioned earlier about all these new people coming in to the city, geographically speaking, where are these people coming from?
There was a very big increase. The question is, the new people coming into the city, who were they? It's a combination. Some higher income people have been coming in. There's been a concerted effort to increase kind of white collar jobs in the city. And a lot of college graduates moving down there and moving in is one part into the kind of renovated parts in the Garden District and Uptown. But also there was a big growth of the Latino population. In fact, there was a movement of Brazilian people from the Boston area down to New Orleans. I talked with some people who worked with Brazilian immigrants, and they said they were all undocumented. In fact, right after the hurricane, the federal government issued a directive of some type that they would not enforce any immigration laws in New Orleans. So they basically were saying, we need construction workers, undocumented people can come. So many Brazilian people said they really liked the weather better than in Boston, and they moved down.
Exactly where did all these people come from? Obviously, not all these people are people from outside the country. Like, what states, what other parts of the country did these people come from? I understand about the whole demographic situation.
Geographically speaking, the city is still below its earlier population, right? And I'm not sure, that would be a good question, of sort of what states the people came from who moved in. They're definitely higher income, but I don't know which states they came from.
You don't know what region they came from?
I don't, no, I haven't looked at that. But with the 2010 census, you could look at where they lived 5 years ago, and that would be a good way of looking at that. Yes?
Thank you very much for this very interesting. I'm looking at your last point that you sort of left off with community, community to recover. That would be the way to go. I'm wondering how you do that in this situation where, the place was waterlogged and a lot of disease and big problems, right? So how do you do that? It's not like
Right. Well, it's a very good question, right? The question is, how would you do it? How would you take community into response? And actually, when I first started doing this research and I was reading about what was happening in New Orleans, and I had a kind of knee-jerk liberal reaction to there was a plan at one point to shrink the city, and it was going to shrink it from the primarily African-American areas. They were going to not reopen the Ninth Ward. And my knee-jerk reaction was, sure, they're going to, take away the land from the poor people. That's a terrible thing, and I was opposed to it. And I still have a lot of issues about it. On the other hand, what they did instead was worse, because they didn't shrink the city at all in any centrally planned way, but they left places half alive and half not, and people kind of trapped in them in individualistic ways. I've been reading about what has been done in China. It's a very different society, and not one that we could replicate in many ways. But with the earthquake, because they have so much control over people, they basically are saying, this village is going right here. You're not going back to where you were, but everybody in this village is going here. Now, you may be very resentful about the loss of freedom of movement, but from a a viewpoint of kind of what helps people to recover from this. The idea that everybody was in the same boat and moved to the same place is a better approach. I think one thing that you could do with community kinds of things, taking it into account, was in fact partly what they did with taking people to Houston. In part, people got on buses in front of that convention center and they were just taken to wherever. So some lady we interviewed ended up in some rural place in Alabama, and they just got off the bus and they said, here you are, and people brought her some clothes, and she was the only person from New Orleans there, and she was alone, and she just stayed there for a couple of months. But at least the people who went to Houston went together, and they were put in apartment buildings kind of close to one another. That's more of what should be done. People should not be individually just put on planes and buses and sent in isolated ways.
Are there studies being done to monitor the emotional damage that has been caused because of how different the city is now, like culturally and economically and the diversity?
You know, there's a lot of studies that have been done about Hurricane Katrina, and but in fact, I think that you're exactly right. There should be longitudinal studies, and the issue is, like, except for our study that had people, you know, a sample and then follows them wherever they go, it's very difficult to do this kind of research because people disappear, right? They disappear into wherever they've gone and they kind of assimilate, and you don't know, are they doing better or worse? So there is our study, and there's a few other studies that are checking in with the same people over time, but probably not as much as there should be.
I just had a couple of questions. My first question was, what did you find most rewarding about your study and your research? And then my second question is, do you feel like your research was well worth it? And it was, again, do you also feel like it makes a difference?
Right. Great questions. The questions were, what did I find most rewarding about my research, and do I feel like it made a difference? The thing I find most rewarding about the research is actually talking to people and documenting what happens to them over time. You know, there was so much attention to New Orleans after the hurricane, and then, you know, we went on to the next issue, right? And we forgot about these people, and then, you know, at the 5-year anniversary, there were some specials on TV, et cetera. But people are still coping day to day with some of these issues, and their kids are coping with them, et cetera. So I do feel like somebody should be documenting what's happening over time, and so I find that rewarding that I've kept the spotlight on what's happening to these people when others, you know, when journalists have moved on. The other thing, whether or not it's made a difference, I don't know. Sometimes when you do research, you don't know whether it's made a difference for a very long time because you're just doing the research and, you know, documenting things and publishing the articles, and you're hoping actually that it will have an effect on policy. I do know that the women that we've talked to have been very happy to talk to us, that we were a little worried about contacting them, that maybe they would feel like this was intrusive, and they had signed up for a community college study, and here we're doing a disaster study. But in fact, they were like, when are you going to come and interview us again? I want to talk about this. They really want to talk and process it. So in that way, doing the interviews is a rewarding. Yes. Yes. The question is, the people were at Delgado Community College, and yes, the community college was flooded. We went down about 2 months after the hurricane, and the faculty were living in the FEMA trailers parked on the campus. There was one building that had the least amount of damage. They were closed for the fall semester. In January, they reopened with online courses and a few classrooms in one of the buildings. And they have very much increased their online offerings. They're back open now completely. And one of the things that we're monitoring over time is how many of these people actually get their degree and then go on and get their college degree. And many of them re-enrolled in the new places in which they settled they're very committed to finishing their education.
If you were interviewing single men, for instance, instead of brothers, how much of this was based on their children and families?
So really good question. How much of this is because we're interviewing women, and how would it be different if we were interviewing men? Some of it would probably be the same, but because they're mothers of young children, I think in part they're really, they can't get too depressed. Well, I mean, the ones who are really badly off can, but a lot of times they kind of pick themselves up faster because they have to do it for their kids. There have been some studies of men following disasters. Generally, women tend to have more symptoms after disasters than men, but whether that's because women are just more likely to talk about their feelings and admit them, I don't know. Yes?
Do you happen to know why the government decided to do so much individual basis for people coming back and deciding that it was just going to be on an individual basis and not open up full communities? Like, did they see a lot of benefits towards that?
Well, you know, there's a long story about that. The question is why was the city planning that happened and the recovery so individualistic? There was a planning commission that was put together and had hearings, and you know there was a lot of politics around this. Some communities like Lakeview came together, but they had a lot of resources. They were the richest neighborhood. They came together, they talked, they thought about how to kind of redevelop themselves, and they got a lot of outside support, and they really were able to recreate their neighborhoods. But we live in a society that's very individualistic and very market-driven, and in fact the market is really what's driving the recovery in New Orleans. So if it's a neighborhood in which the rents are going back up, people can recover their investment, then they can sell and they can do what they want. But in a neighborhood where there's not demand for the houses and where you can't get insurance because it's under sea level, there's just a catch-22 where you can't walk away from your mortgage and you can't start over. And so there's a lot of difficulties to that. So a lot of people are kind of stuck in these neighborhoods in which, for instance, there's no grocery store. The grocery stores didn't reopen because it's market-driven. And so, you know, there's a lot of, I think, failure of leadership to really make some hard choices about how you might recover differently.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to thank Dr. Waters for very memorable inaugural lecture. You set a platform for us now. Years ahead, and we're very good.
Thank you very much.
Very grateful too for your inspiration to us in terms of your scholarly life, your commitment to rigorous data collection and analysis. And our students here will continue to pursue this conversation, and I know our students will continue to go to New Orleans and serve.
That's great.
So
That's great.
Proud of them. And I invite all of you now to join Dr. Waters, the Hakim family, and the alums over in the Fenway room for a reception. And I know several of the students will be going to International Hospitality Night tonight, so please feel free to come to the building before you get to the conference center.